Deep in the mist-shrouded mountains of Colombia, where ancient peaks pierce the clouds like forgotten gods reaching toward heaven, lies a secret that has haunted humanity for over 5 centuries. A secret so powerful it transformed kings into beggars, scholars into madmen, and entire expeditions into ghost stories whispered around dying campfires. They called it El Dorado, the Golden One. But what if everything you think you know about this legendary city of gold is wrong? What if the greatest treasure hunt in human history was built on a lie so beautiful, so intoxicating, that it consumed the souls of everyone who dared to believe? Tonight, we're going to uncover the truth behind one of the most enduring mysteries in human history. Not the sanitized version you learned in school, but the raw, bloody, magnificent obsession that drove men to cross oceans, climb impossible mountains, and die in agony thousands of miles from home. Because the real story of El Dorado isn't just about gold. It's about transformation, spiritual awakening, and a sacred ceremony so profound that when Europeans first heard whispers of it, they couldn't comprehend what they were actually witnessing. But here's what will shock you most. The legend of El Dorado was never about a city. It was never about vast mines overflowing with precious metal. The original El Dorado wasn't even a place you could find on any map. It was something far more extraordinary, far more sacred, and ultimately far more tragic than any treasure chest could ever be. What we're about to explore together will take you from the shores of a mystical lake where gods once walked among mortals, through the blood-soaked expeditions that claimed thousands of lives, to the archaeological discoveries that finally revealed the stunning truth. We'll witness how a single misunderstanding between 2 vastly different worlds sparked centuries of obsession, death, and ultimately one of the most important cultural revelations in human history. So, settle in, because this isn't just the story of El Dorado. This is the story of how legends are born, how they evolve, and how sometimes the most beautiful myths contain the most devastating truths. High in the eastern Cordillera of the Andes, where the air grows thin and the world feels closer to the divine, lived a people whose understanding of gold would forever change the course of human history. The Muisca civilization flourished in what we now call Colombia, but they weren't just another indigenous tribe lost to time. They were master engineers, sophisticated traders, and most remarkably, they possessed a spiritual relationship with gold that European minds simply could not comprehend. Picture this: a vast highland plateau stretching endlessly toward the horizon, dotted with emerald lakes that mirror the sky like scattered jewels. Here, the Muisca built not monuments to conquest or displays of imperial might, but something far more profound. They created a society where gold held no monetary value whatsoever. To them, this shimmering metal wasn't currency, wasn't treasure to be hoarded in vaults. Gold was something infinitely more precious. It was the flesh of the sun god himself. The Muisca didn't mine gold from their territory because, ironically, their land contained virtually none. Instead, they built their entire economy on something Europeans would have considered worthless: salt. They were the salt lords of South America, trading this essential mineral with neighboring tribes who paid in gold, emeralds, and exotic goods from across the continent. The Muisca understood something that would take economists centuries to grasp. True wealth doesn't come from what you dig from the ground, but from what others need that only you can provide. But it was their spiritual ceremonies that would ultimately doom them to centuries of unwanted attention. Deep within their territory, cradled in the rim of an extinct volcano, lay Lake Guatavita. To European eyes, it was just another body of water. To the Muisca, it was the sacred heart of the universe, the dwelling place of gods, the portal between the world of the living and the realm of the divine. When the time came to crown a new leader, the Muisca didn't simply place a crown on his head or hand him a scepter. They performed a ceremony so extraordinary, so visually stunning, that when Spanish conquistadors first heard descriptions of it, They assumed they were listening to fairy tales. The future ruler would retreat to a cave, alone in darkness, fasting for days or even weeks. No salt, no chili peppers, no human contact. He was preparing to die as a mortal man and be reborn as something greater. When the sacred day arrived, the entire community would gather at the shores of Lake Guatavita. Imagine the scene. Thousands of people covering the circular rim of this pristine mountain lake, their voices rising in ancient chants that had echoed across these waters for generations. Fires burned so brightly they seemed to challenge the sun itself, sending pillars of smoke into the thin mountain air. Musicians played instruments that had been passed down through centuries, creating a symphony that seemed to make the very mountains tremble. At the center of this magnificent spectacle floated a raft unlike anything the world had ever seen. Crafted by master artisans, it carried 5 figures, the future ruler and 4 attendants, all of them adorned with gold jewelry so elaborate, so heavy, that every movement sent ripples of light dancing across the water. But the centerpiece of this ceremony, the moment that would haunt European imaginations for centuries to come, was the transformation of the man who would be king. Standing naked before his people, the future ruler was covered from head to toe in a sticky tree resin. Then came the moment that would give birth to a legend. Assistants would blow fine gold dust over every inch of his body until he became something that existed nowhere else on earth, a living, breathing man of gold. El hombre dorado, the golden one. Picture this figure standing on that raft, his entire body catching and reflecting the early morning sunlight like a statue come to life. The gold dust didn't just cover him, it transformed him into something divine, a bridge between the mortal world and the realm of the sun god. Every breath he took, every slight movement, sent tiny flecks of gold shimmering through the air like falling stars. The raft would then be paddled slowly, ceremonially, toward the exact center of the lake. The crowds would fall silent, the music would stop, and in that moment of perfect stillness, something magical would occur. The golden man would raise his arms to the sky, acknowledging the sun god from whom his temporary divinity came, and then he would dive into the sacred waters. As he emerged from the lake, gasping in the cold mountain air, every fleck of gold would have been washed away. The divine coating that had transformed him into a living god now sank into the depths of Lake Guatavita, an offering to the underwater deities who would protect his reign. But the transformation was complete. He had entered the water as the Golden One and emerged as a legitimate ruler, blessed by gods, accepted by his people, ready to lead the Muisca into whatever challenges lay ahead. The ceremony didn't end there. As their new leader stood dripping on the raft, now fully human again but spiritually transformed, the real offerings would begin. The 4 attendants, still gleaming with their own gold jewelry, would begin hurling precious objects into the lake. Gold figurines, emerald ornaments, intricately crafted ceremonial pieces that represented months or even years of skilled craftsmanship, all of it disappearing beneath the dark waters as gifts to ensure divine favor. From the shores, the thousands of witnesses would join in this sacred act of giving. More gold, more emeralds, more precious offerings would arc through the air and vanish into the depths. The lake became a repository not just of material wealth, but of spiritual intention, community faith, and the collective hopes of an entire civilization. This wasn't greed. This wasn't waste. This was the most profound act of faith imaginable, the willing sacrifice of material wealth to ensure spiritual prosperity. The Muisca understood something that European minds, obsessed with accumulation and conquest, simply could not grasp. True power came not from what you could take, but from what you were willing to give away. But the Muisca had no way of knowing that hundreds of miles to the north, Spanish ships were cutting through Caribbean waters, carrying men whose hearts burned with an entirely different kind of fire. These conquistadors had heard whispers fragments of stories passed down through coastal tribes, tales of a man who covered himself in gold and threw unimaginable treasures into a mountain lake. But when these stories reached European ears, something catastrophic happened. The sacred was transformed into the material, the spiritual became the commercial, and a profound religious ceremony was reduced to nothing more than a treasure map. The first Spanish expeditions into the Colombian highlands weren't looking for El Dorado at all. They were searching for gold mines, following the same brutal pattern that had already devastated the Aztec and Inca empires. But when Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada and his exhausted, disease-ravaged expedition finally stumbled into Muisca territory in 1537, they discovered something that defied all their expectations. Here was a civilization that possessed vast quantities of gold, but didn't seem to value it the way Europeans did. Muisca leaders wore elaborate golden ornaments, but they weren't hoarded in royal treasuries. Golden objects decorated temples and homes, but they weren't treated as ultimate symbols of power. Most confusing of all, the Muisca seemed perfectly willing to trade gold for what the Spanish considered worthless trinkets, glass beads, iron tools, pieces of cloth. It was during these first confused encounters that Spanish chroniclers began piecing together the story that would eventually become the El Dorado legend. Through interpreters and hand gestures, through broken conversations and cultural misunderstandings, they learned about the ceremony at Lake Guatavita. But what they heard wasn't what the Muisca were actually telling them. The Spanish understood the physical details: a man covered in gold dust, vast quantities of treasure thrown into a lake, a ceremony that involved the kind of wealth that could finance entire kingdoms. But they completely missed the spiritual significance, the religious transformation, the community bonding that made the ceremony meaningful to the Muisca. All they heard was gold, 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 and more gold than they had ever imagined in their wildest dreams. Juan Rodriguez Fraile, one of the first chroniclers to record the ceremony in detail, wrote descriptions that would ignite European imaginations for centuries. He described a raft loaded with gold, attendants dripping with precious ornaments, and a lake that had swallowed centuries' worth of offerings. But his account, like all the others that followed, focused entirely on the material wealth and completely ignored the profound spiritual significance of what he was witnessing. This fundamental misunderstanding would prove to be one of the most destructive cultural collisions in human history. The Spanish saw waste where the Muisca saw worship. They saw lost treasure where the Muisca saw necessary sacrifice. They saw opportunity where the Muisca saw the sacred. And from this tragic misinterpretation, the legend of El Dorado was born. But the story gets even more twisted. By the time these accounts reached Europe, they had been filtered through multiple layers of translation, exful thinking. Spanish conquistadors, adoration, and wished desperate to attract funding for new expeditions, began embellishing the tales. The ceremony at Lake Guatavita became a daily ritual instead of a rare coronation. The offerings thrown into the lake multiplied in value with each retelling, and most significantly, the focus shifted from the Golden Man himself to the place where all this wealth supposedly existed. European mapmakers, working from second-hand accounts and pure imagination, began marking locations on their charts labeled El Dorado. But they weren't marking the actual Lake Guatavita, which was a specific, real place that could be found and visited. Instead, they were creating fantasy kingdoms, entire regions supposedly overflowing with gold, cities where the streets were paved with precious metals, and every building gleamed with wealth beyond measure. The transformation was complete. El Dorado had evolved from a person to a place, from a sacred ceremony to a treasure hunt, from a profound spiritual experience to the ultimate get-rich-quick scheme. And once this mutated version of the legend began circulating through European courts and taverns, there was no stopping the madness that would follow. Kings mortgaged their kingdoms to finance El Dorado expeditions. Noble families bankrupted themselves outfitting ships and hiring mercenaries. Experienced explorers abandoned successful careers to chase rumors of golden cities hidden in the depths of South American jungles. The legend had become a virus, spreading through European consciousness and consuming everyone it touched. But perhaps the most tragic irony of all was happening back at Lake Guatavita itself. By the time the Spanish had organized their first serious attempts to drain the lake and recover its supposed treasures, the Muisca civilization was already crumbling under the pressure of colonization. Disease, warfare, and forced labor were destroying the very people who had created the ceremony that started it all. The sacred lake that had once witnessed the transformation of kings was about to become nothing more than a muddy crater in the desperate pursuit of gold that was never meant to be recovered. The Spanish couldn't understand that the gold at the bottom of Lake Guatavita wasn't treasure waiting to be claimed. It was prayer made manifest, community faith transformed into physical offerings, the tangible expression of a people's relationship with the divine. Every piece of gold resting in those dark waters represented not wealth but worship, not greed but gratitude, not accumulation but sacrifice. Yet even as the true meaning of the ceremony was being lost forever, the legend it had spawned was growing stronger, more alluring, more dangerous with each passing year. European expeditions were already being planned, ships were being loaded with supplies, and men were preparing to die in the Amazon rainforest, all in pursuit of a golden city that existed only in their imaginations. The stage was set for one of history's most spectacular wild goose chases, a centuries-long obsession that would claim thousands of lives, consume vast fortunes, and ultimately lead to some of the most important geographical discoveries in human history. But it would all be built on a foundation of misunderstanding so profound that even today, most people still don't know the real story of El Dorado. The first man to truly understand what he was hunting died screaming in the Amazon rainforest, his body ravaged by fever and his mind shattered by the realization that he had spent his fortune chasing a ghost. But Gonzalo Pizarro wasn't just any treasure hunter. He was the brother of Francisco Pizarro, the conqueror of the Inca Empire, a man who had literally bathed in Incan gold and thought he understood how New World riches worked. He was about to learn that El Dorado would break even the mightiest conquistadors. In 1541, Pizarro assembled what would become one of the most catastrophic expeditions in the history of exploration. Picture this: 220 Spanish soldiers, the cream of colonial military might, each man dreaming of returning home wealthy beyond imagination. But that wasn't all. Pizarro had also conscripted 4,000 indigenous porters, men torn from their families and forced to carry European dreams of wealth into the green hell of the Amazon basin. It was an army large enough to conquer kingdoms, and Pizarro believed it would be more than sufficient to claim the golden city that haunted his dreams. The expedition began with all the pomp and ceremony befitting a royal venture. Pizarro had received official backing from the Spanish crown, complete with detailed maps drawn by men who had never set foot in South America and royal decrees granting him dominion over whatever lands he might discover. The soldiers marched out of Quito in gleaming armor, their weapons polished to perfection, their hearts burning with the same fever that had driven Spanish conquistadors to topple the Aztec and Inca empires. But the Amazon rainforest doesn't care about your armor. It doesn't respect your weapons, or your royal decrees, or your dreams of glory. Within weeks, the expedition was stumbling through a green nightmare where every step forward felt like a descent into madness. The canopy above blocked out the sun, creating a perpetual twilight world where men couldn't tell day from night. The air was so thick with humidity that breathing felt like drowning. And everywhere, there were sounds that didn't belong to any world these Europeans had ever imagined. The indigenous guides, the men who actually knew how to survive in this environment, began disappearing. Some fled in the night, slipping away into the jungle like ghosts. Others simply collapsed and died, their bodies unable to withstand the brutal pace Pizarro demanded as he pushed deeper into the unknown. The Spanish soldiers, weighed down by their metal armor and European clothing, began falling victim to diseases that had no names, fevers that burned through their bodies like wildfire, infections that turned simple cuts into death sentences. But Pizarro pressed on, driven by something more powerful than reason, the absolute certainty that just beyond the next river, just past the next mountain ridge, lay the golden city that would make him the wealthiest man in human history. Every setback became proof that he was getting closer. Every death was just the price that had to be paid for ultimate riches. Every moment of doubt was crushed beneath the weight of his obsession. Then came the moment that would transform disaster into legend. 3 months into the expedition, with supplies running dangerously low and men dying daily, Pizarro made a decision that seemed logical at the time, but would ultimately lead to one of the most remarkable accidental discoveries in human history. He ordered his lieutenant, Francisco de Orellana, to take 50 men and sail downstream to search for food and supplies. It was supposed to be a quick scouting mission, a few days at most. Orellana was supposed to find provisions and return to rejoin the main expedition. But the Amazon River had other plans. As Orellana and his men were swept downstream by currents more powerful than anything they had ever experienced, they quickly realized that returning upstream was impossible. They were trapped in a wooden boat, being carried inexorably toward an unknown destination, with no choice but to continue forward into whatever lay ahead. Behind them, Pizarro was left with a dwindling force, no supplies, and the growing realization that his El Dorado expedition was becoming a fight for survival. What happened next reads like something from a fever dream. Orellana, rather than finding the golden city he had been sent to locate, instead became the first European to navigate the entire length of the Amazon River. For months, he and his men drifted through landscapes that defied description, past indigenous settlements that seemed to materialize out of the green walls of the jungle, through rapids that should have killed them all, surviving on whatever they could catch or trade for along the way. The irony was devastating. While searching for a mythical city of gold that didn't exist, Orellana had accidentally discovered something far more valuable: the largest river system on Earth, a waterway that would eventually become one of the most important geographical features in human understanding. But at the time, all he knew was that he was lost, alone, and thousands of miles from anything resembling civilization. Meanwhile, Pizarro was learning the true cost of El Dorado obsession. Of the 4,220 men who had begun the expedition, fewer than 200 would survive to see Spanish territory again. The jungle had consumed them with an efficiency that was almost supernatural. Disease, starvation, attacks by indigenous defenders protecting their territory, accidents, suicides, madness, despair. The Amazon had an endless arsenal of ways to kill European invaders who thought they could simply march through and take whatever they wanted. When Pizarro finally limped back to Quito in 1542, he was no longer the confident conquistador who had set out to claim El Dorado. He was a broken man, haunted by the screams of dying soldiers, tormented by the knowledge that his obsession had led thousands to their deaths. His official report to the Spanish crown was a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement, describing the expedition as unsuccessful and recommending that no further attempts be made to explore the region. But even as Pizarro was writing his report, other men were already planning their own El Dorado expeditions. The legend had become too powerful to be stopped by something as mundane as facts. Each failure only seemed to prove that the Golden City was better hidden than previously thought, more heavily guarded, more carefully protected by the indigenous people who supposedly built it. Rather than discouraging treasure hunters, each disaster only fed the growing mythology. The Spanish authorities, desperate to prevent further catastrophes, began officially discouraging El Dorado expeditions. Royal decrees were issued forbidding unauthorized exploration of the Amazon basin. Colonial administrators were ordered to deny permits for treasure hunting ventures, but these official prohibitions only made the legend more alluring. If the Spanish government was trying to keep people away from El Dorado, it must mean there was something valuable worth protecting. This is where the story takes a distinctly English turn, because across the Atlantic, in the court of Queen Elizabeth I, a man was reading Spanish reports about El Dorado and seeing opportunity where others saw only disaster. Sir Walter Raleigh, explorer, poet, courtier, and dreamer, was about to become the most famous El Dorado hunter in history. But unlike the Spanish conquistadors who had come before him, Raleigh wasn't just looking for gold. He was looking for something that might be even more valuable, a way to challenge Spanish dominance in the New World and secure England's position as a global power. Raleigh had access to Spanish documents that most English explorers could only dream of seeing. Through a network of spies, diplomats, and captured prisoners, he had pieced together a version of the El Dorado legend that was both more detailed and more seductive than anything that had circulated before. According to Raleigh's sources, El Dorado wasn't just a city, it was an entire empire ruled by a king so wealthy that he made the Inca emperors look like beggars. This golden empire, which Raleigh called Manoa, was supposedly located on the shores of Lake Parime, somewhere in the vast unexplored regions of modern-day Venezuela, Guyana, or Brazil. The lake itself was described as being larger than the Mediterranean Sea, its shores lined with cities whose buildings were constructed entirely of gold. The emperor of this realm was said to possess armies equipped with golden weapons, fleets of golden ships, and treasures so vast that European minds couldn't even comprehend their scope. But Raleigh's version of the legend contained an element that made it irresistible to English strategic thinking. The Emperor of Manoa was supposedly eager to form alliances with European powers who could help him fight against Spanish encroachment. If Raleigh could reach this golden empire before the Spanish did, he wouldn't just be claiming treasure, he would be securing a powerful ally in the ongoing struggle for control of South America. The plan that emerged from these calculations was breathtaking in its ambition. Raleigh would sail to the coast of South America, navigate up the Orinoco River into the interior, locate the Golden Empire of Manoa, establish diplomatic relations with its emperor, and return to England with both treasure and a military alliance that would shift the balance of power in the New World. It was the kind of plan that could make a man the most celebrated explorer in English history, or get him killed in a jungle on the other side of the world. But Raleigh had one crucial advantage that the Spanish conquistadors had lacked. He actually understood that the indigenous people of South America were potential allies rather than just obstacles to be overcome. His strategy wasn't based on conquest and brutality, but on diplomacy and mutual benefit. He planned to present himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, offering to help local tribes throw off Spanish oppression in exchange for their assistance in reaching the Golden Empire. This approach would prove to be both Raleigh's greatest strength and his ultimate downfall, because while it made him more successful than previous El Dorado hunters, it also put him on a collision course with the Spanish Empire that would eventually cost him everything he held dear. In 1595, Raleigh's ships cut through the Caribbean waters like knives through silk, carrying not just men and supplies, but the crystallized dreams of an entire nation. This wasn't some desperate treasure hunt mounted by bankrupt adventurers. This was a royal expedition, blessed by Queen Elizabeth herself, equipped with the finest navigational instruments money could buy, and staffed with men who understood that they weren't just searching for gold, they were attempting to reshape the very balance of global power. But the moment Raleigh's boots touched South American soil, he discovered something that no Spanish report had prepared him for. The indigenous people he encountered weren't primitive savages waiting to be conquered. They were sophisticated political actors who had been dealing with European intruders for decades. and they had learned to play these pale-skinned strangers against each other with a skill that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. The first indigenous leader Raleigh encountered was a man whose Spanish name was Antonio de Berrio, but whose real identity was far more complex. He was a Spanish colonial governor who had been searching for El Dorado since the 1582nd, mounting expedition after expedition into the Venezuelan highlands, each one ending in failure, each one costing him more men, more money, more of his sanity. When Raleigh captured him during the assault on Trinidad, he found himself face to face with a living embodiment of El Dorado obsession. Berrio was a broken man, but he was also a treasure trove of information. Under interrogation, he revealed details about the interior of South America that no English explorer had ever heard before. He spoke of vast river systems that twisted through impenetrable jungles, of mountain ranges that rose like walls against the sky, of indigenous kingdoms that commanded armies numbering in the tens of thousands. But most importantly, he confirmed what Raleigh most desperately wanted to hear. Somewhere in that green vastness, the golden empire of Manoa was waiting to be found. What Berrio didn't tell Raleigh, what he perhaps didn't even understand himself, was that every piece of information he possessed had been filtered through layers of indigenous misdirection. The tribal leaders he had encountered during his own expeditions had quickly learned that the best way to get rid of Spanish treasure hunters was to send them somewhere else, preferably somewhere dangerous and far away. The stories about golden cities always seemed to be just beyond the next mountain range, just past the next river system, always tantalizingly close, but somehow never quite reachable. But Raleigh was convinced that where Spanish brutality had failed, English diplomacy would succeed. He began his journey up the Orinoco River not as a conqueror, but as what he believed to be a liberator. At every indigenous settlement he encountered, he delivered the same carefully rehearsed speech. He had come not to enslave or exploit, but to offer alliance against the Spanish oppressors who had been ravaging their lands for generations. The response was everything Raleigh could have hoped for. Tribal leaders welcomed him with elaborate ceremonies, shared their food and shelter, provided guides and translators, and most importantly, confirmed that, yes, the Golden Empire of Manoa was real, and yes, it lay somewhere deeper in the interior, just beyond their current territory. Each conversation seemed to bring El Dorado closer, seemed to make the legend more concrete and achievable. But what Raleigh was actually experiencing was one of the most sophisticated information warfare campaigns in pre-modern history. The indigenous peoples of the Orinoco Basin had developed a strategy of stunning elegance. They would welcome European treasure hunters with apparent enthusiasm, provide them with just enough accurate information to establish credibility, and then send them on wild goose chases that would keep them occupied for months or years while accomplishing absolutely nothing. Every tribal leader Raleigh encountered had a different version of the El Dorado story, each one slightly more elaborate and enticing than the last. In some versions, Manoa was ruled by a king whose palace was built entirely of gold bricks. In others, it was an entire city where even the common people wore golden ornaments that would make European nobles weep with envy. Some informants claimed that the lake on which Manoa stood was so large it took weeks to sail across, while others insisted that the city itself was built on artificial islands connected by golden bridges. The genius of this strategy was that it contained just enough internal consistency to seem believable while being so vague about specific locations that it was impossible to definitively prove or disprove. Each time Raleigh thought he was getting close to pinning down Manoa's exact location, new information would emerge that suggested it was actually somewhere else entirely, always just beyond the range of his current expedition. And so the legend of El Dorado reveals its ultimate truth. It was never about gold at all, but about the collision between two worlds that could never truly understand each other. The sacred became profane, the spiritual became material, and a profound act of faith became humanity's greatest treasure hunt. Today, Lake Guatavita rests in protected silence, its waters still holding the prayers of a vanished civilization, while somewhere in our collective imagination, the Golden One continues his eternal dive into the depths of mystery.